This is lecture number 17 in the series The ABCs of Communism. The text for this particular lecture is going to be in chapter 32 of next year's ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2015, which you could pre-order next month, sometime in October, if you want to do, so that you can replace your 2014 copy with this 2015 one. Or it's going to be about 900 pages when it's published next year, so for $2.99 you may just want to get a whole new copy. But at any rate, what I'm going to do today is take you through the course of the Nicaraguan Revolution up until the time that the Communist Party seized power there in Nicaragua. Okay, let's begin with prehistory, as we always do when we're dealing with these Latin American countries. The earliest entry of humans into Nicaragua, of course, is also upon the earliest entry of humans into the entire New World. I'll just repeat one more time that I think the best study of this is the one that I did myself some years ago, which is you can get in used book form from a book called Peopling of the New World, edited by Jonathan Erickson, on the cover of which you have my picture of the three major earliest tool traditions in the New World and how they relate to the Old World. But let's just say for the moment that we can agree that people were in Nicaragua by 40,000 years ago. Now, this is a good place to take a look at the geography of Nicaragua, because the entire pre-communist period there features the country divided into two halves. The western half, which features very large lakes and moderate climate, and it's composed to the eastern half of Nicaragua, which is low-lying, largely rainforest, hot, humid, and insect-infested. Now, western Nicaragua has been the subject of intense archaeological study for the last 10 years, and off and on archaeological study prior to that. A chart done by Professor McCafferty at the University of Calgary and one of his associates has shown the first page of this particular chapter. And what you can see is that for western Nicaragua, he has a pretty continuous socio-cultural evolutionary sequence from 2000 BC, that is 4,000 years ago, up to the time of white contact, by which we mean Spanish contact. Let's assume that these earliest people that came in there were there by at least 40,000 years ago. Now, in a moment we're going to take a look at the map of Nicaragua, so you can see that this division of the country is a very real thing. Now, originally, the western half of Nicaragua was invaded by the Aztecs, who set up their own administration for Nicaragua, based out of Guatemala. They also set up a trading base near the town of Rivas on the Pacific Ocean side. And that trading base was established by at least 2000 BC. So we know that well before the arrival of the Spaniards, that Mexico, that is New Spain, as it would become known, but before that it was the Aztec Empire, the Mexican Empire, had contacted the Central Andes. It's only a hop, skip, and a jump now from that island base off Rivas, Nicaragua, until you hit the coast of Colombia. And hitting the coast of Colombia means you're also hitting the northern part of the Central Andean Mountains. That would have provided both sides an opportunity to engage in trade with things that neither one of them had. The first maize, that is corn, probably got to them from Mexico. And likewise, we think the first potatoes and manioc probably got to the Aztecs from South America on this route. And there would have been other things too, like cocaine, for example. Certainly by this time, powdered cocaine was being produced in the Central Andes, and one could only assume that it was as much of a hit among the wealthy Aztec ruling classes as it would be among ruling classes all over the world later on. So, the Canadian base here, the Nicaraguan base here for contact between North and South America we can see becomes pretty important well before the Spanish arrived. Now, the name Nicaragua comes from two different things. The Aztec name for the people of that area was Nicaro, and the agua portion reflects the Spanish word for water, and most of this was because of Lake Nicaragua, which is a huge lake in the middle of the western half of that country. At the time of white contact, there were probably just about 1 million native peoples in all of Nicaragua. But that contact eventually wiped out most of the Indians of the western half because of diseases and because of enslavement. So by 1530, the native Nicaro people of the western half of the country of Nicaragua were pretty well exterminated. I'm going to take a look here for a moment to show you how real this actual geographical division is. This is the southern border of Nicaragua right there, and this is the northern border of Nicaragua right there. Costa Rica on the south, Guatemala on the north. Now, once you're there, you can just put this pin right here. You can see it pretty neatly divides the country right in half. This entire side over here is humid, low-lying, insect-infested, undesirable place to be for most Europeans. This side over here is much like the Mexico City region. That is, it's high, it's relatively dry, it has a moderate to temperate climate, and it has this huge Lake Nicaragua, which we just mentioned. The other thing I mentioned before was this little Rivas Peninsula, which is right down here. You're not going to really see much here on this particular map, but you can see that it's just above the Costa Rican-Nicaraguan border. This is where the Aztecs had, for a long time, had a big trading base we know about archaeologically now that extended from their empire down here. They would have taken boats down here, and then other boats would have gone to Colombia, which is right down here, almost next door, and that is the northern part of the Central Andes. So once you made that connection, there was every reason in the world to see cocaine and potatoes and cassava flowing northwards into Mexico and vice versa, corn and whatever else they had to trade that was moving south toward the Central Andes. And that would have occurred by a couple thousand years ago. Now, what we're going to see soon is that in the 1800s, Cornelius Vanderbilt who was a New York millionaire, built a fleet of ships that would go up the river here that separates Costa Rica and Nicaragua, enter the lake, come over to the Rivas Peninsula, unload onto wagons and stagecoaches, the freight and the passengers, take them about 10 miles across this little strip of land to the Pacific Ocean port, and then ship them all the way north to San Francisco. For that, he was charging $300 a piece to as many as 2,000 men per ship. So this was an extremely, and they wanted to do this because of the gold rush in California, the so-called 49ers. So that is how that trout, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but that's how that got started. Now today, the Chinese have made a deal with the Nicaraguan government to build a real transoceanic canal that will connect this lake on this side with the Pacific Ocean, with the Caribbean over here and the Pacific Ocean over here. And that project is already underway, and it has poured a huge amount of money in here. So for the first time, the Nicaraguan government is probably looking at a substantial surplus in its treasury. Okay, we're going to switch back to the lecture portion now, but you can see the west and the east half of this country have been real different for thousands and thousands of years. On the western half, you have these Nicaro Indians and other tribes that the Aztecs found and had good relations with. And on the other side, you have these Mosquito Indians, they're called, M-I-S-K-I-T-O. The British later called this Mosquito Coast for not only that reason, but I think probably because of all of the mosquitoes too at the same time. At any rate, the social geography of Nicaragua continues from the time of the Aztecs right through the Spaniards. Now, the first Spaniards who entered the New World were actually Christopher Columbus. His real name is Cristobal Colon, if you're speaking in Spanish. He arrived 10 years after 1492 on the coast of Nicaragua, on the Caribbean coast. But he didn't stay there very long. He made a note of it in his voyages, and he kept on moving. I think for the obvious reason that there wasn't nothing there on that coast that would attract a person very much, unless they had, some kind of reason to wanting to be living in a swamp. So the real first Spanish invasion of Nicaragua comes instead from the Spanish colony in Panama. And this was a guy named Gil Gonzalo Davila, who in 1522 decided to go up the west coast of Central America and invade what is now Nicaragua from that end. And he had just recently established the outpost in Panama. And as usual, he and his associates were there for one reason. They were trying to find some gold. And, there was enough success stories by now from Cortez's adventure that wherever you had what we might call poor white trash in Europe, you could count on them getting on boats and getting over somewhere into the Caribbean region, where they could, at the very least, they could be pirates or privateers. And if they got lucky, they might get involved in some adventure that would give them another city like Tenochtitlan, that is like Mexico City. At any rate, he got a bunch of these guys together, and they went up there and they invaded the western half of Nicaragua, and by 1530, they had exterminated most of those Indians. Well, he had trouble back home with some of his Spanish thugs that he had a falling out with, and so he had to run from Panama to the island of Hispaniola. I won't spend too much time on this, except to show you that these guys, it's like any other group of gangsters. They might have one leader one day, and another year or two, he'll have another leader. And so in this case, Davila took off for Hispaniola. He had enough street cred with the lumpen proletariat out there that he was able to put together another gang. They came back to fight for control of this western half of Nicaragua again, and this struggle goes back and forth. And it's in this period of time that the cities of Leon and Granada are established, and those will become important later on. The Viceroyalty of New Spain was formed in 1538, and then encompassed Mexico, Guatemala, and all of Central America, including Nicaragua, except for that Panamanian colonial base, which the Spanish wanted to keep independent. It was too important to them not to run it directly, because Panama was the connection to all the silver in Peru, and that by now the Spanish crown had fully realized the importance of getting control of the mines in Mexico and Peru. Well, we could go up through all of this, but I'm not. If you want to, you can read it in your book in terms of which general fought which general for what control. But in the eastern half of Nicaragua now, the Mosquito people were resisting foreign attempts to take over their territory, and their resistance was a little more effective because they had the natural environment going for them. What kind of societies were they by 1600? Well, these people were definitely in the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage, and that of course meant that it wouldn't be very long until some of these ranks became classes, and the mechanism by which the state could emerge was there because one of the major ways these Mosquito Indian tribes and chiefdoms had been able to make money was by selling their services as mercenary soldiers to somebody or other, the Spanish, one Spanish group or another, or the British. Now, the British had control of Nassau, Bahamas, that is, British people who were either working with the British government or working against it, depending upon what year it is, for that kind of to take a look at how the loyalties of the people in Nassau were shifting back and forth on an almost daily basis. You might want to watch this Star's original television series called Black Sails. I haven't seen a better explanation of life there than that. Now, these people got the name of buccaneers because they had brought a lot of beef and pork to these Caribbean islands. These animals got loose. They just ran wild and multiplied. And so just about anybody could go get themselves, say, a pig and cut it into strips, smoke and dry and salt those strips, and then you could use that for a long period of time. It was kind of they were used to eating dried meat, so this gave them the protein base they needed upon which to conduct their buccaneering activities, because these strips of dried, smoked and salted beef and pork are called boucan. So there comes the name buccaneer. Now, they were all virulently anti-papist, that it means anti-Catholic, so they made short work of the Franciscans who had gotten in there to try and convert the Mosquito people, and they began to make the Mosquito Coast their own property. And they introduced their own concepts. When the British beat the Spanish for control of Jamaica, this gave these buccaneers a new life, and they moved in large numbers down to the Mosquito Coast and set up a town there called Bluefields, which is still there. Bluefields was the name of a pirate operating out of Nassau who, when the Nassau pirates finally made a deal with the British Crown, he was able to bridge that gap, move into the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua, and build his little town of Bluefields, and eventually sold it to the British. So that British Honduras would, and this lasted up into the 1800s, would extend all the way from that entire coast of Nicaragua and inland to the point at which it stops being a swamp, and then all the way up the Caribbean coast into what the tail end of it would have been what's today Belize, or in Mexico we used to call Belize. That it was the last place to be called British Honduras before it got independence. So this particular area, now the British have carved out for themselves. Their form of life and government, of course, was quite different, because this Mosquito territory is not cut out to be a latifundia, but it certainly was cut out to be a trading area, and that's what happened. So for about 300 years, Western Nicaragua is just a copy of Spanish feudalism for all of New Spain. That is, a bunch of latifundias, a bunch of haciendas which are self-sufficient and living off the labor of a bunch of enslaved peons. That and then the eastern part of Nicaragua was under some or another kind of buccaneer leadership in alliance with some Mosquito advanced theocratic chiefdoms, and Britain. So the Mexican Revolution of 1828 was the beginning of the dissolution of that kind of Spanish-based latifundia system. In 1650, a Spanish slave ship carrying blacks from Africa was the center of a slave revolt. And the slaves killed their Spanish masters, took over the ship, sailing it to the Mosquito Coast. There they crash-landed at a place called Cape Gracias de Dios, thank God Cape, and they met the Mosquito people and made their adventure against the Spaniards well known. So the Mosquitoes hated the Spaniards for what they had learned about them and the few direct contacts they'd had with them, and so they welcomed these black slaves warmly, and the black slaves soon intermarried with the Mosquito peoples on the new homeland and created an entirely new population. So that situation lasted from 1650 up until about 100 years later, when it seems by this time that The blacks had been absorbed by the mosquitoes, although probably their racial makeup had been somewhat changed, and but culturally they'd been absorbed. And the Mosquito Kings and their class brothers soon had an army and police force in their very private hands, because it had been these groups of men that they could sell their mercenary soldier services to, who all they had to do was convert them to working for themselves. Well, the relationship of Nassau British Buccaneers with the British Crown was always an ambiguous one, as you see in that movie or that TV series called Black Sails. It ranged from outright hostility some years to an alliance other years, and likewise the presence of buccaneers on Mosquito territory tended to switch back and forth as relations with the British Crown were concerned. And eventually this had to lead to a Mosquito-English alliance, and it did. So the British colonialists were carving away at this this eastern half of Nicaragua beginning in 1655, and that rule lasted some 200 years until around 1850. In 1678, the Brits made the town of Bluefields their colony's capital. And I just told you where Bluefields got its name, from a pirate based out of Nassau. New Spain collapsed altogether, and in 1821, when western Nicaragua broke away, forming the United Provinces of Central America. After the first, in 1821, that half of Nicaragua that had belonged to New Spain gained its independence, which is to say the western half. It became part of the United Provinces. Now, we could go through all of this. I took one family called the Chamorro family because it's still important today, and showed how they began to emerge back there in 1804. So that family has a very long tradition, but I'm not going to go over that right now. Now, in 1823, Nicaragua's United Provinces government announced that henceforth slavery would be abolished. Now, in so doing, the Granada oligarchy was siding with the North American Union side of the future U.S. Civil War. And that's going to have an important ramification here momentarily. Well, this Chamorro guy that gave rise to a bunch of kids, one of whom, by another wife, eventually led that family into bringing Nicaragua into the modern period. The Nicaraguan accession to the UK, that is, that side of it, the eastern side, was formalized by the imperialists in 1894 in their Court of International Justice. But just prior to that, we have the American Civil War and the ramifications of that. Remember, I mentioned to you that Vanderbilt started this shipping business, which was extremely profitable, moving people from the east coast of the U.S. to California across Nicaragua. Well, at a certain point, Vanderbilt lost control of all of his properties down there. And without going into the details of it, what he decided to do was to back an American adventurer named William Walker. Now, Walker was the scion of a Tennessee slavocrat family, so he'd had all of the advantages of a wealthy class background in terms of education and travel, but he was very much in favor of the South and its slave system. What he had done was to go to California, and out here he had put together a mercenary force. Skipping over the history of that force, just suffice it to say that Vanderbilt hired him to go to Nicaragua with his mercenaries, a couple hundred what you would probably call poor white trash adventurers from North America, as his soldiers, and overthrow the regime in Granada, and so that Vanderbilt could get his property back. Well, I'll try and cut that part short. He was successful. That is, Walker was successful, and around in 1856 he had overthrown the government in Granada and declared himself to be the president of a new Republic of Guatemala, and he applied to Washington for recognition. The Secretary of State in 1856 was Jefferson Davis, the man that was about to become president of the Confederacy. And Davis was very happy to recognize Walker because Walker legalized slavery his first day in the government. And I'm just going to bring this Vanderbilt story up to a conclusion. Eventually, Walker didn't last very long. He lasted from July of 1856 until May of 1857, when a combined force of Nicaraguan, El Salvadoran, Costa Rican, Honduran forces took him into custody. And then he was delivered to New York by an American naval captain in May of 1857. In New York, Walker wrote a book where he got himself some more investors, and he organized a couple of more forays into Nicaragua, which was a mistake because the U.S. was getting closer and closer to civil war, and Walker was becoming increasingly unpopular in places like New York because he had reinstituted slavery in Nicaragua. So what happened down there was that he got defeated, captured again, taken north, and there he was executed on September 12, 1860 by Honduran authorities. That date, September 15th, 3 days later, became the Independence Day for Nicaragua and all of the Central American republics. From a socio-cultural economic standpoint, the important thing was that the latifundista and mercantile families of Grenada had won the Civil War against Vanderbilt and Walker. And these families took command of Nicaragua for the next 30 years, that is until 1893. The ruling families of those days of León buckled under and accepted Grenada's mercantile capitalist latifundista leadership. To give you an idea of what Nicaragua's ruling class holdings looked like at that time, it might be useful for you to go back and think about what England looked like during its civil wars when Cromwell was fighting royalists with the New Model Army. When you take a look at the pattern, it looks like a checkerboard with pretty evenly distributed loyalists and Republicans. Nicaragua looked pretty much like that too. Why is that? Well, because the Spanish system of latifundia, where you have a self-contained hacienda, a bunch of peons working for you, was also featured these guys getting invested in trade ventures, financing different kinds of shipping operations and so on, especially if they lived close to Rivas. But this wasn't something that was done only by the ruling families of Grenada as opposed to those of León. The ruling families of both had their feet in both of these kinds of economic activity. So you're going to have several things happening now. For one thing, Vanderbilt decides to get the hell out of Nicaragua. It's becoming way too expensive to keep fighting to hold on to your properties and never know where your next enemy is coming from. So as the U.S. Civil War developed, Vanderbilt refocused his effort on building railroads for the Union in the North. And shortly after the Civil War, Dr. Durant's Hell on Wheels operation, if you've seen that AMC movie, got started to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and then he got involved in that. Because in the U.S. you could rely upon the Army to suppress the natives, and that was all you had to worry about. You couldn't. If you wanted to have an army suppress natives in Nicaragua, you'd have to buy it. You'd have to finance it, and that was expensive. So Vanderbilt got out altogether. By 1893, these latifundistas based out of Grenada had a real falling out among themselves, and another general came to take power. This other general had a lot of difficulty. His name was Zelaya. He had a lot of difficulty for the same reasons that his predecessors had a lot of difficulty. They have latifundistas involved in trade. They all have differences among themselves in terms of getting paid or getting cheated and who was due what. This new guy that comes in is named Jose Santos Zelaya, And he finally gives up establishing order on his own, and he asks the U.S. to send the Marines, which they do. So from 1909 until 1933, the Marines occupy Nicaragua, and they eventually get defeated there and forced to come back to the U.S. The man that gets credit for that is named Sandino, the general that fights the Marines to a standstill. At the same time, what you want to remember is that by the time these are withdrawn in 1933, Roosevelt has just become president. He was elected in 1932, and he's confronted with the very strong probability that there may be civil war in the U.S. again as workers begin to rise up in some cities like San Francisco and seize control of the of state power, and where farmers are beginning to take control of the states, dumping produce into the borrow pits. It only would take a small spark at this point to set off a real civil war. Communism is on the horizon as far as U.S. ruling class is concerned, because the communists in California have made real progress in terms of seizing state power, and they're talking about doing the same thing across the U.S. So another reason those Marines were withdrawn from Nicaragua had to do with the U.S. domestic politics. They were going to be needed back in the U.S. to suppress uprisings, especially by communists and labor unions in the cities. Okay. This guy that gets credit for defeating the Marines, named Augusto Cesar Sandino, was a general in this Nicaraguan army who fought first the Chamorro dictatorship and then fought the U.S. Marines directly. Now, Chamorro is one of these guys I said we're going to skip past, but you can read about it in the book. Sandino managed to defeat the Marines and force them out in 1933, and then I mentioned that the Great Depression certainly helped a lot, because Washington wanted its troops back home as it was looking for an imminent communist revolution in its homeland. Well, Sandino, therefore, had led an indigenous revolution against U.S. imperialism, and he'd won. He became the national hero whose name would forever be attached to subsequent anti-imperialist struggles in Nicaragua. On their way out the door, the Americans had left a puppet regime in power, which they had more confidence than they had in the Chamorro family, which had demonstrated that they could not hold power unless it was backed up by U.S. Marine bayonets. And since 1909, they hadn't gotten any better, so this is 1933. This time, the gringos left in place a military force called the National Guard. The U.S. had trained, armed, and financed this National Guard, and they had trained and bought the man they put in charge of it, named Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Now, in 1933, Garcia is confronted with a triumvirate of men. Himself, Juan Bautista Sacasa, and General Sandino, the guy that had fought the Marines to a standstill and gets credit for sending them home. Now, the U.S. Somoza dictatorship period is going to last from 1934 until 1979. Well, as you can see, that is a long period of time, 45 years. So the U.S. was able to run Nicaragua for 45 years using the Somoza family as its personal dictatorship. I go through the different, there's several generations of Somozas involved here, so I go through those, and you can read about each one after the other, but they're all essentially the same, complete toadies of Washington who brag that they can speak English better than they can speak Spanish, who go to U.S. military schools and then get college degrees from places like West Point. So they are culturally and ideologically part of the U.S. imperialist regime for Central America. Now, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, was created in response to the U.S. use of Puerto Cabezas, which if you look on your map again, you're going to see that's on Nicaragua's Caribbean coast. The Mexican ruling class had gotten rid of the CIA conspirators in Mexico in 1960, and by the time I got there in 1962, they had been long gone. So, but they were gone before the U.S. invasion at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961 from Mexico. So, to take their place, they had, of course, their colonial regime they'd established in Guatemala under Colonel Castillo Armas, and they had this loyal puppet regime of the Somozas in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, Somoza gave Puerto Cabezas, the port I just mentioned on the Caribbean coast, to the gringos to use as the basis for launching their invasion of Cuba. When that invasion was defeated, the university students in Managua and Leon created a revolutionary instrument they called the National Liberation Front in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, on July 23, 1961. You can see this is just a couple of months after the U.S. invasion in April of '61 at the Bay of Pigs. So I'm sure the Cubans were anxious to give them assistance too, because of payback for what the U.S. had just launched against them out of this Somoza port in Puerto Cabezas. By this time we had Carlos Fonseca, a man that was going to lead the Nicaraguan Revolution, and then by 1963 we had Tomas Borga and a bunch of others whose names won't mean much to you now, but they are in the book if you're interested. It's interesting because Carlos Fonseca was like Fruto Chamorro or Eva Perón in that he was a bastard of second family origins. His father was a wealthy man and his mother a household servant. For those of you who may not be familiar with it or maybe didn't understand it the first time you saw the movie Evita, it was common practice for wealthy men in Latin America, in every country, to have not only a wife and children in a legal marriage, but perhaps just a few miles away, a mistress and her children in what was a de facto second marriage. That's where Evita Perón came from. This is where Fruto Chamorro had come from, that kind of a background. And this is also where Carlos Fonseca, the first leader of this Sandinista front, was like, and that's where he came from. Fonseca had been born in the northwestern Nicaragua town of Matagalpa, with a servant girl mother and a rich father. A father that eventually accepted him as a son and helped him go to school, and he took his mother's last name in the paternal position, his father's in the maternal position, to give Carlos Fonseca Amador as his final name. He joined the Nicaraguan Conservative Party youth organization with Matagalpa and in high school, and then he eventually came to Karl Marx in the library. That changed his life. In 1954 he joined the Nicaraguan Socialist Party. In 1957 he attended the World Youth Congress in Moscow as the PSN's delegate and came back to write a glowing report about the USSR. You might recall, if you know Cuban history at all, that before Raul Castro joined with his brother Fidel to put this armed seizure together for at the 1953 attempt to seize the Moncada barracks, that Raul Castro had gone to the World Youth Congress as a Communist Party delegate from Cuba, which his brother thought was a complete waste of time, and he said, listen, when you get back from doing all that nonsense, find me, because I'm going to need you with this project I'm about to launch, which is to overthrow Batista with my own army. At any rate, so these World Youth Congresses were important because they brought people that were on the verge of joining a Communist Party right up to that point and showed them all the wonders of socialism in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on. Well, anyway, enough said about all of that. In '62, the FLN had only 60 members in Nicaragua. Thomas Borga crossed the border from Honduras to recruit more members, and as he did so, he would bring them back into Honduran mountains as a refuge, that an area where the Borga group could await the return of Fonseca and his recruits from Cuba. In '63, Fonseca did return, and the FLN was reformed as the FSLN, putting the name Sandino into it for the first time. So, then they got actively involved in ambushing government forces in the northwestern part of Nicaragua in what's called the Pancasan region, near the town of Matagalpa. And there they skirmished for the first time with Somoza's National Guard. Luis Somoza faced a rising tide of discontent back home, and he decided to stage an election that year in 1963, try and put a little bit of democratic authenticity onto his puppet dictatorship. Well, this didn't have any effect upon those who were fighting against him, of course. And who knows, I don't even remember how strongly the U.S. Cap press tried to support that so-called election down there. But at any rate, it doesn't seem to have had any significant impact of what was going on, because the guerrillas kept fighting, and they kept moving closer and closer to the capital, which is Managua. And by '64, that is the following year, at least 6 of these guys had been arrested in the Managua area, and including Fonseca, who did another one of these Fidel Castro history will absolve me kind of speeches from his hospital bed, which was again the courtroom that the dictatorship put him into. And in '64-'66, the Soviet KGB under Alexander Shelepin began to send Fonseca men and women who had been trained in the Soviet Union, and who now he was supplying them with the kind of weapons they would need, and they went back to Nicaragua with this Soviet training, Soviet weapons, and they started training the way they had been trained their fellow Nicaraguans. 40 male and female guerrillas at this time, well armed, skirmished again with National Guard troops in the Pancasan Mountains of northwest Nicaragua. This is where the original crossing down the Rio Cocos y Bocay had ended up. That is, the previous year they had fought their way down this far. Just as a matter of interest for those of you who might be thinking about visiting Nicaragua, which today is a very safe place to visit and a very prosperous place because of this Chinese canal that's going through, there is a trip you can take down this particular river as a tourist, and there are several different tourist agencies I noticed that are advertising, and people that have taken this trip. I haven't been one of them. I've been up to this area, but I didn't go up there as a tourist. But at any rate, the people that have taken that trip tell me it was one of the high points of their life of going on adventures during summer vacation. At any rate, whether you go up there or not, you got a picture of how this, the kind of area that you're involved in. Well, this skirmishing with the National Guard up there was being reported in the Nicaraguan press, and this was important because the U.S. Somoza regime had been doing this exact same thing they'd done in Cuba. That is, when you will recall that Batista and the U.S. ambassador were telling everybody in Cuba that Fidel Castro's been wiped out, he's dead, there's nothing left out there. And they said it so many times over a period of a couple months that lots of Cubans had believed it. Well, the same thing was going on here. The U.S. ambassador and the Nicaraguan cap press are telling the Nicaraguan people that all these rebels up there who thought they were going to overthrow our government have been completely wiped out. But the new skirmishing between the National Guard and the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the news of it quickly spread through the towns, some of which are quite large in northern Nicaragua, and so the whole thing began to fall apart. But instead of throwing in the towel, the way Eisenhower had done when he finally abandoned Batista to his just deserts, Nixon and Ford decided to go all in and fight until they went down, or the communists did. And I'll tell you, the outcome is going to be is that they're going to go down. But this is how it happened. Now, at this particular time, which is the urban fighting of 1967, Daniel Ortega Saavedra enters the picture. He is the current president of Nicaragua, and he was the first president of Nicaragua. But in 1967, he comes to public attention because he robbed a Bank of America branch in Managua, and he was only 15 years old, and he got caught. And he was thrown into the El Bodelo prison on the outskirts of Managua, and he was tortured until 1974. So that's 7 years. That's a pretty stiff sentence. And in '74, he was exchanged for Somocista thugs, that is, Somoza's thugs. Daniel Saavedra had a brother, and his name was Humberto, and he escaped to Cuba rather than going to prison after this bank robbery. And there in Cuba, he got the training he would need to fight Somoza and to try and break Carlos Fonseca out of his Costa Rican prison, and his other brother, Daniel, out of prison. He had another brother named Camilo, who died fighting the dictator in 1978. This whole family, Daniel, Humberto, Camilo, you can see they were deeply involved in this armed struggle from the time that they were kids. As a consequence, well, all of this had started in 1955 for them because their father was what we might call a small businessman, a petty bourgeois businessman, who had been forced out of business, which was a textile and chemical import brokering business, by the Somoza dictatorship. Somoza wanted every business in Nicaragua for him or somebody in his family or his gang. So the father had been forced out of business in '55, which meant they had to go to public schools instead of private schools. And there they found Marxism because some of their public school teachers were communists, and this changed their lives. So they went from being disgruntled petty bourgeoisie to active working class Communist Party leaders. In 1969, Fonseca was out of prison and he was elected the Sandinista General Secretary. Tomas Borga was arrested in January '69 in Costa Rica, and then he was lucky enough to get deported to Colombia, for where he made his way to Peru and then Cuba. And along the way he even visited a Palestine Liberation Organization base in Lebanon. So Carlos Fonseca was elected national leader in '69. A poet and literary light named Omar Cabezas emerged in these years, and he wrote a book about his formative years of transition to Marxism called Fire from the Mountains, which I looked up at Amazon. You can buy it there. So it might be worth, any of you have a real interest in Central America, you definitely want to read that book. On December 23rd, '72, a massive earthquake leveled Managua. The Somoza press admitted to 10,000 people dead, 20,000 wounded, and 250,000 out of Managua's total population of 325,000. The Somoza government said were homeless. The U.S. State Department thanked Somoza for helping to overthrow Arbenz in Guatemala, for trying to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs in the Gringo Guzano invasion, and Nixon therefore sent 600 Marines to Somoza's house to guard it and bivouac them on his estate. And meanwhile, the Somoza gang began the wholesale theft of all of the relief supplies and money that were coming in for the victims of the Nicaragua earthquake. Some believe that the president, Somoza, made at least $400 million on the relief theft itself. The Somoza brothers, the president and the National Guard boss, not only stole all of the money coming in from international relief sources immediately, they kept stealing it for years. One Somoza thug, Colonel Rafael Porras, bought a piece of land in '75 for $70,000. He sold it 3 months later to the government relief organization for $3.5 million US. Most of Managua would remain in ruins for years. What contracting that was actually done to reconstruct Managua was with totally corrupt handouts to Somoza gang members, such as this that we just mentioned. When these truths leaked into the Sandinista underground press, and Chamorro had an occasionally legal opposition press called La Prensa, the public rage became focused on their real enemy, and did much to prove that only FSLN, that is the Sandinista Front, could solve the problems of Nicaragua. Even the Catholic Church, long a supporter of reactionary regimes throughout Central America, revolted when Somoza tried to force them to send their Catholic relief money to his Liberal Party thuggery, supposedly for distribution to the needy of Managua. Well, these Catholic bishops and archbishops like Obando y Bravo, they're not stupid. They know that that money is all being stolen, and so they're not going to send their Catholic money there. And they even went to the point of supporting those Catholics and parish priests who were actively opposing the dictator. So Somoza's support is falling apart everywhere because of his rampant greed. Obviously, the Somoza gang has decided they're going to steal everything they can right now and then get out of town. In December '74, the FSLN attacked the dictator and freed their prisoners from the Somoza prison. And they also made the government pay them $2 million ransom, because this time they had taken a bunch of Somoza family members as hostages. In '75, Somoza responded to the increased militancy of the Sandinistas in his usual way, meaning the random torture and murder of Nicaraguans living in the poorest barrios, and of course in this he got the full support of the United States. He imposed a national state of siege with a total press censorship. Carlos Fonseca, was then captured in '75 and killed in '76. Chamorro was assassinated in '77, and that brought over what remainder of the liberal bourgeoisie that had resisted Somoza to the revolution. On January 28, '78, National Guard gunmen assassinated Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. Pedro's wife, Violeta, took command of La Prensa. She would become a president of Nicaragua in the near future. FSLN then launched 1978 offensives against the dictator on 5 new fronts. These were in Matagalpa, Leon, Masaya, Estil, and Chinandega, and they continued their attack on Somoza forts in Managua. The dictator hunkered down in his fort there, that he called El Bunker, and tried to fight it out, but it was all over for him. In 1979, in March, the FSLN announced a new directorate. I remember this quite well because I was still in a Peruvian prison at that time, but I had several colleagues who were linked into this and were keeping me informed about how the Civil War was going. So I won't bother reading you the names, because until you read the book, these names probably won't mean much to you. But at any rate, on June 4th, '79, the Sandinistas called for a general strike that shut down everything. Every business, every industry, every form of transportation. On the 16th of that month, that is 12 days later, they announced that Daniel Ortega would be the new president, and then there were several other members, including Violeta Chamorro, who were going to be members of the government. The U.S. Embassy tried to create substitutes for Somoza, but it was too late. The Gringo ambassador told the Somozas to flee to Miami, where they would be safe, which they were, until, like Batista before them, the Gringo regime decided they were too hot to handle in the U.S. Batista had fled to Dominican Republic and then to Portugal. This guy fled to Paraguay and associated Somoza, and there a CIA contract killer killed him. And that was the end of the embarrassing relationship between between Washington and the Somozas. Well, of course, it wasn't really the end of it, was it? I mean, people that you might trick the North American people into believing some of this stuff, but you're never going to trick the Latin American people, especially Nicaragua, into thinking that suddenly the U.S. has become their friend. So, on July 19th, the FSLN army entered Managua as the victors, And the next day, these top leaders that I just mentioned that went in. Well, the war was over, but the revolution had just begun. That is, on July 20th, 1979, the struggle for the seizure of state power has begun. What was the role of the Communist Party in all of that? Well, in case you forgot, they were the ones who had gotten started with the National Liberation Front idea to begin with, and their original party had been formed in 1922 when the Mexican Communist Party had taken Borodin's entire idea to heart and had begun setting up these communist parties in every country of South America. So again, this Nicaraguan army was something that or communist parties came directly out of Borodin's initial setting up of the Latin American Bureau for the Communist Party of Mexico to run. And then it continued right on up through this sequence of events where the National Liberation Front is created, then it becomes the Sandinista National Liberation Front. It merges with Cuban communism, and the Soviet Union sends its top KGB chiefs for this part of the world to get Nicaraguans, bring them back to Russia, train them, give them weapons, and send them back to start training their own people, teach them how to fight, strategy and tactics, and from that time on, they just steadily build their bases in all of these cities that are important in Nicaragua, and eventually they take power as part of a broad front. I think it's safe to say that in the Sandinista Liberation Front proper, these people are Marxists, but in the broader group that they put together to take Managua and form a government, they have many bourgeois, like these Chamorro elements, present also, because the idea is to build a broader class alliance in much the way that Fidel tried to do in Cuba in 1959 in his first year. And the next lecture we're going to go on to will be about Venezuela.